This is the only truth to the fable of the Tower of Babel, that no one could understand written language anymore. Because these stories were no longer carved in stone, many of them being blended together and adapted into the developing religion of Judaism.
Aron Ra's explanation of the story of the Tower of Babel is a gross exaggeration of the story of how the Iliad and the Odyssey were written. Just heard it, thought it was interesting, wrote it down from the Phoenician alphabet, first Western world books, the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Construction was begun by Hammurabi, but with the fall of the Mesopotamian Empire,
So the end of the dynasty of Hammurabi is 1690.
construction of the Tower of Babel stopped and the schools closed.
Because you have to pay the teachers. They can't learn how to read and write anymore. They weren't doing it like the Hebrews. We did it as homeschoolers. You know, just like it says in Deuteronomy 6. These commandments will be on your heart, and you will teach them diligently to your children, talking of them again and again when you are sitting in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down and when you arise. They'll be written down as signs on your doors and on your gates.
With exaggerations, enhancements, and embellishments irresistibly creeping in over so many generations, some of these stories were eventually written down again by the Phoenicians.
Phoenicians who could write. They thought, well, that was a great story, and they wrote it down. That's 900 BCE. However, in between those two, actually this is only 140 years later, in Babylon, this was written down.
The building of this temple offended the gods. Genesis says it was God, not the gods. In a night they threw down what had been built. They scattered them abroad. And there was a confusion of languages, just like it mentions in Genesis chapter 11.
Aron Ross told me he's taken my point.
Moses of Koren also has a book that says, this book was translated from Chaldean into Greek by the authors of Alexander. It contains the story of the ancients, ancestors from the origin. And this is what he quotes from it. They bore the impious project of building the tower, and they were already absorbed in the task when a scary divine wind, blown by the anger of the gods, and distributed among the men inaudible languages. He quotes from Sibyl, Ross's daughter. For the tower, before the navigation of Zethruthras towards Armenia, Zervan, Titan, and Yepetose became the governors of the earth. He says, it seems to me that it's Sem, Ham, and Japheth. What I've also pointed out as a challenge, and I'm not saying it's proof positive, noticeable and definitely curious for skeptics, is that where this recounting says that everyone as a humanity was witness to the events, these things that are told everywhere as generalized stories, after the point where they disperse over the face of the earth at the Tower of Babel, then the stories witnessed by these people are not everywhere. So these stories are: Abraham leaving the country, following God into a land. Abraham and Sarah, old people, promised a miraculous son. Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed by judgment by fire coming from the sky. Hagar and Ishmael, lost in the desert, given a miraculous spring in the desert, they established themselves. Abraham tested to sacrifice Isaac and then told not to, because he is proven faithful. Isaac's wife Rebekah being shown by a coincidence, indication, miracle. Jacob and Esau, twins and rivals. One is favoured, the other condemned. Joseph's brothers jealous of him and selling him to slavery. Joseph interpreting a dream of a coming disaster and organising the salvation and preservation of Egypt. Joseph, seeing the end of the evil done to him by his brothers, is used by God to save the end of things. Ishmael and Hagar being talked about by Muhammad and the Muslims is obvious because Arabs are descendants from Ishmael. Romulus and Remus doesn't count for Jacob and Esau because it was after, even though they are similar.
Childhood of Moses, which was itself adapted from the childhood story of Sargon.
Sargon, the mighty king, king of Akkad am I. My lowly mother conceived me. In secret she brought me forth. She placed me in a basket of reeds. She cast me upon the rivers which did not overflow me. The river carried me. It brought me to Aki, the irrigator. The irrigator in the goodness of his heart lifted me out, as his own son brought me up. Aki the irrigator, as his gardener appointed me. When I was a gardener, the goddess Ishtar loved me, and for 4 years I ruled the kingdom.
Well, that's very simple. The legend of Sargon was probably very well known where these people were and come from, and Jochebed and Miriam might have got the idea. We get the idea of putting Moses in a basket of reeds and putting him so that the royal family would take him. It doesn't happen like in The Prince of Egypt if you read it. It's actually controlled.
Because what you see is Miriam is actually surveilling Moses. Then when the royal family woman comes, she didn't want her to take it. She could very well have just picked it up and scurried. It was all controlled and it was their idea. And so it's very simply that not the story is written as a plagiarism, but the actual people doing it knew about the idea and did it.
So these texts were amended and redacted and had things inserted into them and were reworked and reinterpreted.
Some things were obviously more appropriate, the collectors felt, than others. They weren't necessarily written to be included in a Bible. The choices that were made as to what should be contained in this collection, I mean, it's very hard to say.
But then, they were producing their own version of what we would consider to be Mosaic law. The Temple Scroll is basically, it's kind of pulling together bits of Leviticus and bits of Deuteronomy. Instead of saying, and Moses did this, and Moses said that Yahweh said such and such, it's Yahweh saying, and I tell you this, and I tell you that. But they were still making it in the 1st century BCE.
Lots of different sorts of traditions that are being adopted and adapted and then readapted by successive writers.
Were really fluid. The Torah wasn't in a fixed form.
Jesus probably didn't have an Old Testament or a Hebrew Bible or a Tanakh. He was referring to a collection. It was a very fluid time.
It's absolutely fine. A book has a textual variations in it.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Hatun, because here I have a copy. There you have the Hebrew text on top, and lo and behold, you've got the apparatus at the bottom. Well, that means Jews have never hidden the fact that there are some textual variants in the text.
Can be like confident. We can see what does it say, all that.
Like the Greek versions, the Septuagint, which were produced in about the 3rd to the 2nd centuries BCE, they show some marked differences from the Hebrew versions that we're familiar with.
Someone had asked a question about, do you have the Septuagint variants in the page? Yes, in the Hebrew Bible here, in the apparatus, there are some references to the Septuagint.
These are religious writings. Some of them got into the Bible, some of them didn't, as we know. There are lots of other Gospels that have Jesus doing amazing things. Jesus striking a child and then killing him and then resurrecting him.
But that's why they're not canonical.
So in the first part, we've seen that even if we think that it's plagiarized, whatever would be influencing them in their environment, be suggesting that what the Bible says might be true. Since they lived in the Levant, they said that what it would be plagiarized from are stories from the Levant, from Iraq, and the Persians. Now they're going to try to say that the Bible was invented when they were in exile in Babylon. With those cultures, the Babylonians and the Persians, who came later,
That's when the traditions that we find in the first 5 books of the Bible are being written, basically. What we seem to have is that a group of very powerful families, descended from some priests, came back from diaspora in Babylonia during the Persian period, sort of 5th century BCE. Okay, we're in charge now and we're going to do things differently around here. I think, the influence of Zoroastrianism in the way in which the demonization of the Satan figure from the 5th century onwards among certain Jewish scribal communities in reshaping and recasting older traditions about this accuser figure. Zoroastrianism, real kind of cosmic dualism, how that particularly plays out in certain eschatological and apocalyptic Jewish groups.
Let's look for Noah. That name doesn't show up until the priestly writers exiled in Babylon around 500 BCE.
The Garden of Eden, you believe, was a real place?
Well, I believe it's based on a real place. It's based on the Jerusalem temple that probably historically was destroyed by the Babylonians in 6th century BCE. The temple itself is meant to be like the dwelling place of the god, and it's the meeting place between the heavenly realm and the earthly realm. And so it was filled with trees, and it was a very sensory experience going on. That's what the story of Eden is based on. It's a king, in this case, was in a very privileged position, like that with God. He messes up, he gets expelled from the garden, so he's thrown out of the temple.
not to say that the Garden of Eden doesn't exist, but Francesca is onto something here. There are often lots of parallels in the Bible. And in this case, what we see is that God is trying to recreate what's inside the Garden of Eden. That's what we see with Israel, that's what we see with the temple, and that's also what we see in Revelation at the end. For my surprise sakes, you could very well have just found this from a rabbi. It's to believe that inside the temple is the ground where the dust was taken to make man. Also, all around you see parallels about the Messiah.
If you don't know Jesus, you don't know jack about the Bible. That's what I'm telling you. And he says, you guys study the Bible all day, and you have no idea what it means. End of Luke's Gospel, Jesus rises from death. takes them through the whole Old Testament saying, this is all about me.
And then you can see the ideology, well, why are they telling the story about escape and slavery and oppression and movement into the promised land?
Some people had thought that maybe it was based on their exile out of Babylon or something.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing. So that's when the Exodus idea really kicks off, I think.
And because the writers themselves were in their own kind of slavery and oppression, but in Babylon, in the 6th century BCE, not in Egypt, hundreds and hundreds of years before that. That makes sense?
Yeah, it does. It makes perfect sense.
Yeah, the point of that question was that I thought that story had to be based maybe a different period. I mean,
perhaps the Exodus story is about a group who were in and out of Egypt, but much, much later. I mean, we know that the community in Jerusalem and nearby didn't just go to Babylonia. A lot of them migrated to Egypt. Then you had famine in the southern Levant. It was an obvious thing to go down to Egypt because it's a tidal climate there, right? You know, the river, rather than relying on rainfall. And that means, well, was there an Exodus? Well, no. I mean, I personally don't think there was at all. There's no, archaeologically, nothing stands up for it.
Ipuwer papyrus, Egyptian person lamenting. It describes the 10 plagues of Egypt. The river is of blood, people are afraid to taste it. Lower Egypt weeps, whole palaces are deprived. Truthfully, grain has perished on either side. The country is without light. Truly, children of princes are hurried against the wall. Also, there's a record of Canaanites fleeing, and where they fled to, and describing Joshua, son of Nun, with the conquest of Canaan.
You know, forced migration to Babylonia. It's only after that, in that period, when stories about the land was taken away, but we're going to be given the land again. This is our new homeland. This idea of coming into the land again.
The problem with this is that the Torah was not only with the people who were exiled in Babylon. The Samaritans had been taken away in captivity by the Assyrians before. When they came back, they stopped having any dealings with the Jews. We even see when Jesus is discussing with them and they're talking about the issues talked about in the Tanakh. And we have a copy of the Samaritan Pentateuch, still used for reference in some of the translations, like the ESV, which is my own. You still would have to say, well, they were both taken into captivity and they both made up the same thing. Because the Jewish one and the Samaritan one are the same book. This is why you're not supposed to listen to people like this. These people are disingenuous. This is what this kind of ilk is. Do you think that Francesca Stavrakopoulou has not heard of the Samaritan Pentateuch?
So maybe Exodus is based on folktale traditions being historicized in order to give an identity to these diaspora communities who are wanting to come back to the promised land, the homeland. But it's also recycling a much older mythic trope of God's battle with a ferocious, raging, serpentine sea. You see that a lot in the 5 books of the Bible as well, the way that those traditions are being incorporated into this story of Exodus.
Serpentine sea.
Thank goodness Francesca didn't go very far on that one in front of Aron. This is what she said somewhere else.
The idea that God had to fight a massive sea dragon to create the world. And you don't get that in Genesis. You get hints of it in Genesis, but you do get it.
Hang on, what are the hints?
The hints.
What? No, like I'm just curious. It's like
on the such and such a day when God was making the world, he made the great sea monsters.
A Christian curriculum which suggests that the Loch Ness Monster disproves evolution is probably a good
The ancient word for this is tannin, which is this ancient, mythical, watery, ferocious chaos monster, a sea dragon.
The word tannin used to be translated dragon. In lexicons, it's now interpreted as snake and cetacean, falsely. In Hebrew, animals are called by their own sound that they make.
Hatul or chatul is cat. Elephant is peel.
And it's also what's used for the letter N. Letters in Hebrew are a picture of the thing. It is the base of the Phoenician one too. I've heard that it means fish, which is wrong too.
These are the things he claimed as proof that dinosaurs lived with men, and that both of the heads are therefore mounted on tails rather than necks.
What this letter is called is Noon. It's even in our collective imagination, and still in these days we make plesiosaurs make that sound.
The dinosaur here, and the zeuglodon, I believe.
No, a zeuglodon is a 4-flippered whale. They went through quite a list of the things you were saying. Specifically, they complained about you trying to misrepresent the carcass of though it were a recently deceased plesiosaur. They had to point out to you that plesiosaurs were, of course, bony reptiles, as opposed to having the cartilaginous cylindrical vertebrae of the shark.
You know, one of the most important myths in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, you get to read all about these different sorts of myths and legends. Like, you know,